Okay, we're recording now, so let's just reiterate. We've changed the due date via request of the student body to from April the 30th for the final paper submission to May the 3rd. That is the Sunday after. Okay. Everything else is the same. Okay. Other than the due date, are there any other questions? Everyone's like, I haven't looked at it yet, don't know. That's fine. Okay. All right. You should see the updated date on the website now. All right. Well, let's get into these week 11 readings. There's some pretty cool stuff, I think, to talk about in this week, and maybe some stuff that's a reiteration of things we've talked about before. Let's start with the Ark and Beyond. So for the next 3 weeks, we have stuff to do for weeks 11, 12, and 13, and then like we're done meeting in person at that point. So for the next 3 weeks, we're doing these like three Ark and Beyond chapters, and then I think one chapter from Wilder Kingdom. So the first question, this first chapter is about the southern white rhino. So what type of conservation effort in situ or ex situ led to the rebound of the southern white rhino population? That's a pretty straightforward question, but we can go ahead and answer it. Jasmine,
In situ.
in situ. Good. Why? Do we have any, like, what's this? Can anyone just give me a brief synopsis of what the story was? Bjorn.
So there was a lot of like poaching going on, and so they established basically protection for the species and tracts of land to help preserve their habitat. The ex situ conservation, it didn't really work out, I think, as well as they thought it would because they, imported a bunch of rhinos, and initially it seemed like they were reproducing well, but then that reproduction kind of stopped. But those were essentially more for an assurance colony, rather than like reproduction and re-release. So the things that really, I guess, impacted the wild populations were the in situ conservation that basically protected their natural habitat.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the second question, why might laboratory work be important to today's southern white rhino population, given the abundance of southern white rhinos alive today? Caitlin.
So females are not reproducing at the rates that they once did, especially in a captive setting. And a lab may be necessary to determine why. And like later in the chapter, they do go into some of the lab work that's already being done, but more work still needs to be done. And determining why is important if zoos want to continue to have a healthy assurance population.
Okay. And in the zoo, within an ex situ framework, there are reproductive problems, and that's sort of what the core messaging of the chapter is about, right? The phytoestrogen. But Bjorn, what were you going to say?
I was going to say the reason they also need it, even though they have a southern white rhino population that's pretty healthy right now, is that as that population increased, so did poaching. I think the
Yes.
book said that there was like a tenfold increase in poaching activities. So the population is basically still at risk to start declining again with all those activities going on.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and this should be somewhat intuitive, if not unfortunate, to think about. As their populations were very low, it was harder for poachers to find them and make a buck on them, right? As populations increase, it becomes easier and easier and easier to do this because there's just a greater density of these animals. And so, as a response, poaching activities increase with the population increase. And so, there's many, many more poachers. now, relatively speaking, than there had been. Or if there may not be many more individual poachers, but more poaching activity as on the whole. It's probably a mixture of both. Because of this, even though the population is healthy, if it's not possible to suppress that poaching activity, it could ultimately lead to the population's eventual collapse. So we could be back where we were, right? Even though it's recovered. So in this manner, there's a necessity to continue to study this animal and learn how to raise it better in captivity for assurance purposes and in any manner that we can study ways to rebound should there be a problem from this increase in poaching. Is there, as a maybe a spin-off of that question, is that the best way to address this problem? Like, is laboratory research going to be the best way to address this problem? Tiffany, what do you think?
I don't, it's not the best way to do it on its own. Because if you're still not helping with the poaching, it's going to continue to be a problem. So, irregardless of how well your population is going to reproduce, they're still going to be poached. So, it's a good addendum, but it can't be the only project that's going on.
Good. What do you all think? What do you do about poachers? If anybody can just solve the problem outright, you're going to get like the Nobel Peace Prize in animals. I don't. Yeah, Caitlin.
I think you need to address like what people factors are driving that. So like, is there a lack of ability to like get an income in some other way? It like what is driving this push for poaching, and like how do you better support the people within that animal's natural range so that by helping the people, like you help the bigger conservation mission and the animal itself. Like usually most people don't necessarily want to be poachers. It's driven by like an economic need of some kind. So trying to address like what struggles the people in that area are facing so that you can kind of like holistically solve the problem.
Mhm. Yeah, very good. Tiffany.
Just from the little I learned from bowling for rhinos, they're actually sending out a lot of basically people that protect the rhinos, but not only just educated people, but people from the local communities. So they also pull them in themselves to try and protect the rhino species. So also kind of giving them an economic process in that way as well. Um, and an education too of how and why we want to protect these species.
Yeah. So you're saying they're paying people to go out and do that. Yeah, so they create jobs for the local community to do the opposite of poaching. Taylor.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like a main reason that people are poaching rhinos is like for medicinal reasons. Like they think like the horn has, you know, some properties that can help. So maybe some education on that. That like there's really no science to back that up. They really don't have any, you know, beneficial medicine qualities. I think I read, I don't know if it was for rhinos specifically, they might have been doing it for elephants, but they're like dyeing the horns and things like that to make it less desirable for people. Like if it's like tainted, then they don't want it anymore. So maybe that can be like a deterrent for poaching.
Yeah, they dye horns. They cut them off, actually. Um, so those are both uh, ways to deter that. Um, you mentioned education on in relation to traditional medicine. My question to you would be, who needs that education? Would educating the poachers fix that? So who?
I think it would have to be like the people who are buying it, like like the consumers. Like if there's a demand for it, these people are still going to go out and get it. They don't care if it works or not, as long as they're getting the money. So I think the people that are buying it are the ones that need to be targeted in terms of education.
Yeah, you have to target the force that's generating that revenue, right? Ryan.
I also think educating the people who are making like the big decisions, so your policymakers, stakeholders, stuff like that, is going to have a big impact. Because who was it? Caitlin brought up stuff about needing income, needing jobs. There's programs that provide jobs to people who are poaching as a way for them to not poach, but also make a living. But those are all based off decisions of people higher up in the ladder. So I think education for those types of people, or at least directed towards them, is important as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. So hmm, if there's a couple different things I want to talk about. Let's talk about let's talk about the medicinal thing for a second. If traditional medicine that doesn't have scientific support for its efficacy is ingrained in a culture because it's tradition and it's just carried on because Meemaw used rhino horn to do whatever rhino horn does. Uh, is there a way to fix that? Because that's one of the things you're talking about doing is you couldn't just like go up to those folks and be like, hey, that doesn't work. That would not do it. Taylor.
I'm not sure if this would completely work, but maybe like offering alternatives um, that can help with like the symptoms they're struggling with. Instead of just being like, hey, don't do that, giving them like another option instead. Like, I don't know if that's necessarily going to change their mindset, but I think it maybe will help at least some people if they have like something else that they can use.
Okay. I mean, in some cases they do, right? Like we have synthesized modern medicines, and while um, some of them are better than others at doing things, uh, there are alternatives. Like they can go to the store and buy NyQuil, if they have a cold or whatever. It just depends on the particular symptom. Um, Tiffany.
If I guess if we're talking about a deeply ingrained culture, the first thing I thought of was like indigenous people being allowed to hunt certain quotas of like seal and stuff. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with it, but if we're removing horns to prevent poaching anyway, wouldn't it be something like, well, if we're taking the horn, we could offer it to these cultural groups, kind of like how we do eagle feathers for
Hmm.
Native Americans and things like that, that if it's something we're doing anyway, we can at least offer them a, I don't know, more ethical version of it, I guess, where the rhino isn't necessarily harmed, but we're removing it, so let them use it anyway.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm trying to think of right offhand which cultures I don't know enough about the background of the folks demanding the rhino horn, but I guess I can Google it and find out. Because I'm wondering who those folks are. Does anybody know off the top of their heads? Bjorn, do you know?
As well, I was gonna say I think it's like China,
I think so too.
mostly Asia.
Hmm.
And I could be wrong about that, but that's also, I mean, I think that was a really great point, Tiffany. But that in this particular situation, I feel like it makes it a little bit stranger because it's a weird network where they're actually poaching in Africa and then shipping it to China. So I don't know if they actually use that in Africa as well as like a traditional medicine. But one thing I was thinking of, like when you're educating or when you're trying to educate the public on, I guess, the lack of scientific evidence backing up these traditional medicines, I feel like it would be much more effective if it came from within the culture. So I think it would be beneficial to work with zoological institutions kind of within that country, like maybe work with zoos in China and then they can actually work to spread the message. I don't know how effective that would actually be, but it seems to me like that would be much more effective than just, a completely different culture like us in the United States basically going over there and saying, "Hey, like you shouldn't do this. This is why." But if it is something that is kind of within their country from other, excuse me, with other like wildlife biologists and researchers and scientists, I could imagine that might be a little bit more effective at least.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the change needs to come from within, um, to be even mildly expeditious. Um, and I looked, it's China and it's also Vietnam apparently that use it for medicinal purposes. So, Caitlin.
So I looked it up too. It was China and Vietnam, but the article I was reading said that China, it's predominantly traditional Chinese medicine, but
Mhm.
in Vietnam, it's often a status symbol thing. Like it's hard to come by and it's compared to a luxury car. But I was thinking about campaigns for this sort of thing and like what has worked. And I remembered that Yao Ming, the basketball player, he campaigned against shark fin soup. He partnered with Wild Aid and campaigned with them, and they thought like it actually did have an impact, and that shark fin soup consumption came down because like he is Chinese, so
Yep.
it was coming from within. So even utilizing celebrities might not be like the avenue we want to go, but it might be an effective avenue to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think utilizing a celebrity is a perfectly valid approach. I mean, whether we like it or not, they have an audience, right? Especially in today's world where they have their Twitter followers or their, I don't know, Instagram followers or whatever they have where they can reach a really large number of people. You know, my little Instagram account with my 950 something followers compared to any famous person has there's a big difference in the amount of reach there. And so yeah, if I had a message and I could put it in the mouth of someone with 1 million followers, that would be the way to do it. Hmm. What was the other aspect? Well, does anyone have any other ideas about how, well, well, let's talk about there's a big difference between a traditional medicine and a status symbol, right? We're talking about in Vietnam, it being more of a status symbol. Is that solvable? I think traditional medicine personally is a more solvable problem than status symbol. What could, I think. What do you think? Tell me what you think. Caitlin, what do you think?
I actually disagree. I think traditional medicine is harder to solve because that's cultural, and like you don't want to come in and tell someone that their culture is wrong. Whereas a status symbol, you just need to get people to think it's not cool. Like you need somebody cool to say that it's like not cool anymore, that it's not trendy anymore, that if anything, that it's like you don't want to be seen with that thing. Like you just need to turn the narrative around from enough people with status to say that like, oh, this isn't even worth it anymore. Whereas like culture is way harder to shift than I feel like what is elite and cool at the time.
I get what you're saying, and you might be right. I have some reasons for thinking it's harder, but I'll talk about that in a second. Tiffany.
I also think it would be harder to change the perspective on traditional medicine for two reasons. One, because it is China, just the sheer breadth of the communities in China and how many of them are so disconnected from the world, getting the information to them seems rather difficult and harder to change their mind. And then not just some of the small communities, but the way China bans certain ways of giving information. I feel like Hong Kong itself, it's easier to get information in and out of, but the rest of China is so disconnected due to the way they are governed, um, that I feel that would make it far more difficult to reach a significant amount of people, especially the ones that are more prone to using it as traditional medicine. Those are generally going to be the more insular communities that aren't as connected to the rest of China, let alone the rest of the world. Whereas Vietnam is a lot more easy to distribute information to, knowledge to, and there are more things to be used as a status symbol that losing one wouldn't necessarily be causing an uproar.
Hmm. So my thoughts on this, and I agree. Everything you guys said makes a lot of sense, and I could be wrong. I'm wrong all the time. But the reason that I said what I say is pretty simple. So if I wanted to convince someone uh, on the medicine front, I have actual, real, measurable evidence, and over time. Now, obviously, if you're talking about elderly folk that have been using this their whole lives, that you have to kind of wait for that generation to pass. But by connecting with the younger members of those family groups, uh, when they're still young enough to learn and assess information, um, you have information, right? We can say, look, this doesn't do anything. Here are all the different ways that we have tested this out, and there's no evidence at all that this will actually help you with, there's evidence, there's some kind of statistical information. That doesn't exist with a status symbol. I can't go to whoever these wealthy, powerful folks are in Vietnam and be like, here's the evidence that a rhino horn isn't cool, right? There's nothing. I have to appeal to them in an ethical, more philosophical sense, and changing changing someone's mind about that to me seems more difficult without some sort of evidence to back up my particular belief. And so that's why I think it might be harder. But I agree with all the points you guys said. Um, and I could be wrong. Does that make sense? Yeah. I do think that if you could get, and maybe this is a reason that it would be easier to convince the status symbol seekers, is if I think if you could convince the right, like if you could just get into like one or two of the very top rhino horn collectors from Vietnam that thought it was really cool. If you could just convince one of the two minds, then it could like percolate from them and radiate out and affect the rest of them. And so in that manner, it might be easier. Okay. Anybody else have thoughts about that? Guess not. Um, all right. Question 3 is what potential causes is or are known for the fertility problems of these captive rhinos? Abby.
I kind of have a longer answer if that's okay.
Great. Yeah.
Okay. I have the specific factors that cause or contribute to poor fertility of captive-born female southern white rhinos have yet to be identified. At the San Diego Zoo Safari Park, which has experienced a marked decrease in fertility of its captive-born females compared with females imported from the wild, behavioral observations eliminated apparent reproductive behaviors as a possible cause. And then I have an investigation into a possible role of stress in reproductive failure, stress hormone levels in female southern white rhinos at 16 North American institutions showed no relation between stress and fertility. And then the last thing I have is the development of pathologies was attributed to long non-reproductive periods associated with high estrogen production, which is dampened when an animal is pregnant. Although this paradigm is not unprecedented, it does not account for why southern white rhinos fail to get pregnant in the first place, or for the possibility that environmental sources of estrogenic chemicals interfere with southern white rhino hormone systems to impair fertility.
Yeah, what specific, there's a specific source of estrogen, there's a type of estrogen that they're talking about. I guess it's a whole group of these estrogen compounds. So what is that? I mean, it's basically what the whole rest of the chapter talks about. Jasmine.
I got the phytoestrogen.
Phytoestrogens, yeah.
Yeah.
That is it. Yeah, the phytoestrogen exposure. So so question 4 rolls right off that. So what evidence is there of phytoestrogen affecting fertility in animals? Has there ever been any evidence prior to the rhinos that they could use as a way of finding this causal relationship? Tiffany.
Eating legumes high in phytoestrogens like soy, clover, and alfalfa had reduced fertility and led to reproductive pathologies in some lab and livestock species.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's evidence for this, right? So as they're trying to assess this, they see this potential connectivity to estrogen, and then they can look at other animals as potential models, right, for like kind of reflecting upon what might be going on in the rhinos. And they say, hey, look at livestock. Livestock exposed to these phytoestrogen compounds in the plants that they eat also have fertility problems. Um, okay. Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, I just thought this was kind of a good spot to point it out, but I think with conservation comes a lot of like attention to diet and nutrition. And I'm also in the nutrition class. And my project for that is very similar to kind of what they did here, except I'm focusing on iron. But um zoos in general, for many species, have a hard time replicating their natural diets, which then causes all these other health issues, but they don't know what to do about it. So I think it was really interesting how, like we talked earlier, it was in situ. They were having trouble doing stuff ex situ, so in situ became better. And it's just because we can't care for them as well and we don't have enough knowledge. But another thing I thought was really interesting about this was that it seemed like in adult stages, or in adult life stages, a lot of these effects could be reversed. But if you had a calf born in captivity, who had some of these estrogen issues, it was pretty much irreversible damage, um, showing that like being in captivity is a major factor for a lot of this, or at least that's how I interpreted it. Had these calves been born in the wild, would they have been able to reproduce similarly, or more effectively than now that they're in captivity and their mothers are getting a bunch of different nutrition and chemicals and diet related things that are different from the wild. So I think that's a big point of conservation that zoos should or are at least trying to focus on more.
Yeah, Ryan, I agree. Yeah, so right I don't know, I feel like we might have gotten ahead on questions, but yeah, it's like kind of touching on question 9. We can talk about it now, though. It doesn't really matter. So question 9 was like about a follow-up study trying to understand the relationship between phytoestrogen and why in the wild they don't see these problems, but in captivity they do. And the ultimate findings of that were that in the wild, these animals, they're not getting exposed to just like the limited range of phytoestrogen rich plants that the captive animals are getting exposed to, right? And that diversified diet that's not as high in phytoestrogen is ultimately keeping them from having those problems. And in addition, there was, as Ryan was pointing out, an age bracket thing as well, where that the younger individuals suffered much more greatly in terms of their fertility through this captive high exposure level of phytoestrogens than the adults did. And yeah, I don't want to just sit here and lecture at you. So I'm not going to just like expound on that. What does that tell us? That Ryan was kind of alluding to. What does that tell us about maybe where zoo research should be looking for some of this stuff? Like, what should zoos be doing? Not just with rhinos, just with animals in general. Yeah, Tiffany.
I think another important part of this is if we back up to question 8, that the southern white rhino reaction was far more sensitive than the greater one-horned rhino reaction. So
Okay.
another problem is a one-size-fits-all plan. It's a rhino, so you feed it a rhino diet as opposed to it's a southern white rhino versus a greater one-horned rhino. So a lot of research needs to go into the specific diet, specific husbandry of species instead of groups of animals. We need to be less broad now. We have the methods to be more specific in our husbandry practices, our diet practices, our care practices. So I do know in a lot of species, they are doing that, but some are also falling behind as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think we just identified a few different areas that zoos should focus on. Can someone just point out what those are? When we're considering diet in a species of conservation concern, what are the sort of areas we need to look at? Yeah, Ryan.
Oh, I think I was going to answer maybe the wrong question. I was going to say just improved research on specific animals, including their health, nutrition, and
Okay, so
well-being.
species with a
Yeah.
specific species specific research. Good. Yeah, okay. What else was in there? Cleo.
I think having like an adaptable diet that changes throughout the life stages of the animal. So like feeding the younger juvenile its specific diet. So research needs to go in what life stage needs what. Make it
Yeah,
successful.
perfect. The life history of the animal, right? Like the dietary needs of animals change over time. Young animals, for example, often need more protein in many species. Um, but looking at what the proportions of those things look like. Okay, Caitlin.
Comparing the actual like nutrient breakdown of captive diets to wild diets when available.
Yep, that's the third one. The Look at the natural history of the species. Really look at in an in situ setting and when they're natural wild range, what are they eating in totality and what does that look like? Do an in-depth study of diet. I think when you combine those three things that we just pointed out together, you have um, the potential to make really good decisions about the diet of captive animals. And without that, you get things like rhinos that can't make babies and that aren't very useful for you know zoo conservation work. So these are the kind of things that if you're ever in a situation where you have to make decisions like about these sorts of things that you have to think about. Yeah, Ryan.
I don't know if we already touched on it, I missed it, but also evaluating the ability of the zoo to actually provide things like this. For instance, for rhinos, you could do a regular pellet-based diet that might give them all the nutrition that they need, but it can also cause health issues. Or you can spend a little bit more money, more resources, spend more time understanding the species like we just discussed, to give them better welfare. And then their ability to do either of those things should impact the decision of whether or not they house that animal or participate in its conservation. Just adding that in there.
No, yeah, well, yeah, I agree. Like sort of looking inward, the zoo looking inward at itself and saying, what can we, what can we do? The zoos need to do that all the time. That's just, I think that's something that universally needs to happen in zoos. I agree. Not just in relation to maybe a conservation project, but just in relation to all of their activities, right? It's being as self-reflective and willing to pivot when things aren't working and that sort of thing is very important. Not just to zoos, to people as well. All right, let's see. We kind of just jumbled our question order, which is totally fine. Just trying to figure out what else we might want to hit on in this chapter. Oh, okay. Well, yeah, we can do that. So questions 5, 6, and 7 all work together. They're sort of about the methodology that they use to do the study. And so the questions are, why is doing, let's start, question 5 is why is doing a laboratory study on, in this particular context, challenging in a zoo? Why, what was the difficulty? Jasmine Anderson.
I had that because populations of zoo animals are typically small and potential experiments need larger sample sizes to obtain significantly powerful data. Also, the zoos needed to provide the strongest links between EDC exposures or suspected long-term multi-generational studies and are warranted, but that these are simply not feasible, particularly for slow producing species.
Yeah, okay. So we've got long reproduction times, which means if you want multiple generations of data, that's a big problem. Bjorn, go ahead.
I was just going to add that it also often requires you to expose the animals to the harmful chemicals. Like often this research, like you have to introduce them to this thing that you think is harming them, and essentially do research that way, or be very, very invasive with tissue sampling.
Yeah, that's one of the really, really biggest ones because if someone finds out you're doing any sort of invasive type of thing in a zoo, people are going to raise hell. Even if it's for conservation, people just, they're going to get upset. Um, yeah, so the low sample size problem is a problem to make statistical inference, right? So, and that's something as grad students, you're all going to have to do some statistics at some point. And someone's going to be like, what's your sample size? And if you're like, I looked at 3 animals, they're going to be like, yeah, nothing that you said actually means anything. That's just not how statistics works. So large sample sizes is a problem when you're talking about bigger animals that zoos don't have like tons of, things like a rhino. Um, and then again, the multiple generations of data tied to long reproductive times is obviously problematic in the rhinos, and then invasive samples. So, how did San Diego get around the uh, some of those limitations? What did they do? Yes, Tiffany.
They focused on molecular mechanisms by which the phytoestrogens and other EDCs interfered with endocrine functioning. So they used in vitro methods to measure interactions, so they didn't require exposing an animal to a harmful chemical.
Yeah. So they're basically we're talking about doing like test tube type studies outside of the body, but with the receptors that are related to these phytoestrogens in the actual animals. Um, so that's pretty cool. How did they go about avoiding the invasive tissue sampling problem though? Because to like get these receptors, you have to have tissues. Bjorn.
They took samples from rhinos that died of natural causes. So they basically took the samples during the necropsies
Yeah.
and then used cloning methods to, I think, reproduce them for the research.
Yeah. So every time you necropsy an animal, you should be thinking, what kind of science can I get out of this guy before we finish the job, right? Like, can I get any information that might help this animal in the future? It's a really honorable is not the right word. What's the word for it? I don't know what the word for it is. It is a good thing to do to pull out of a bad thing, right? Like information that can help the species from the death. I think I don't know how. There's got to be a right word for that, but I don't know what it is. We can skip question 8. Okay. All right. So that's the Southern White Rhino chapter. So we do not read the last chapter in Wilder Kingdom. And this is like the very, very last chapter. It'll be left for you to finish. If you want to say you finished the book this summer, you have to read the last chapter yourself with a whopping 15 pages. Um, it's also about rhinos, and it's not that it's redundant. It's really not. It's just so that we're not double dipping on rhinos. I could make us read it in this section, I guess. Um, so let's move on to the next chapter, chapter 23, which is uh, about applied field research. Okay, question 10 is, in what ways do zoos and aquariums differ in terms of their in situ conservation efforts in a general sense, and why do they do that? If you haven't answered a question in this hour, which describes a couple of you, well, now would be a good time to do it. Cleo.
Zoos and aquariums differ in terms of in situ conservation efforts based on their uniqueness and must set priorities in relation to their goals, objectives, and missions of their individual organizations. And their conservation efforts should generally think about their geographical location, collection, composition, institutional culture, and their financial restrictions.
Okay. Can anyone expand on that or pare it down a little bit? Right?
I wrote in mine that these two similar but different types of facilities, institutions had very different upbringings. So like we talked the history of zoos, they were kind of a power play. They're like, look at all these animals, I have so much money, menageries, whatever. And then also for aquariums, they were kind of founded on fishing principles, economic development. So they had a little bit more of a is utilitarian the right word for that? They were brought up more or less for the people, for humans to use, and for economic purposes, while zoos had a very different past. So their conservation efforts today, I think, kind of reflect that.
Okay. Yeah, that's the argument that is made in the text ultimately is associating the um, the differences or attributing these differences to the origins of aquariums versus zoos. Whether when you look at aquariums, they're born out of fisheries. Uh, when you look at zoos, depending on how far back you want to go, you can say they're born out of lots of things. But if we think about early but not super early zoos, if we think about like zoos in the 19th century, remember that a lot of those zoos, there was a lot of what they're doing is tied into agriculture, which is sort of like terrestrial fisheries, right? And so to me, depending on how far back you want to go, there's a similar origin in this sort of tie between agriculture and fisheries, and there's similarities between those things. Uh, And so, of course, if you go far enough back and you go into just like essentially, the menageries and flexing on people with all of your cool animals, which is essentially what they were doing, that's a different thing entirely. Um, but I think personally, as I was thinking about this question, I think it's just more difficult to do in situ work in a marine environment. I think that is the biggest, to me, that's the biggest thing. Tiffany.
I kind of had that as well, that it's just a different scale to be working in an aquatic ecosystem in a lot of the time than it is to work in a terrestrial ecosystem. And then there's just such the terrestrial threats are far different from aquatic threats. And then you don't really have a community to work with if you're in the middle of the ocean. Everyone kind of doesn't have there isn't a community to work around unless you're on shores or coasts. So when I think about doing aquatic conservation in the actual ecosystem, it just seems so large compared to even something like a large rainforest or anything like that, which seems far more difficult.
Yeah, large, difficult to navigate. Well, I mean, think about what's the name of the aquarium that they're talking about? I can't remember right now. Can someone tell me? In the
Shed
chapter,
aquarium.
Shed, yeah. Uh, what does Shed have? Shed has something that's like a big deal for research. Sorry. They talk about it in the chapter. They're like, Shed has this thing that, and they do marine research on this thing.
Like is it a sub? They have
Was it a
some kind
ship?
of vessel. Yeah.
They have a ship. Yeah, they have a marine research ship. And they pay multiple PhDs as part of their program to go out and work on this ship and do this stuff. That is a huge investment. Absolutely tremendous investment. And I mean, for one, you have to pay PhDs to go do this work, and for two, you have to pay to maintain a marine research vessel. I can't really imagine how much money that costs. I wouldn't even guess. I wouldn't dare to. Uh, yeah, it's tremendous effort to do that, and then to pull in the expertise that can contribute to that. And then, like Tiffany said, so with some of these, when you're talking about say a rare marine animal, you want to talk about looking for a needle in a haystack. You've got the ocean to look through. I mean, to find these things, to learn more about them in an in situ setting. And wow, what a tremendous effort that is. It's amazing, and I think it's worthwhile. I don't just think it's worthwhile. I think it's necessary. Uh, but you can see, I think, from that where the difference lies. This is my opinion. Um, I disagree with the author of the chapter on why they're so different. Um, but there could be truth to the origin thing as well, right? I mean, there's probably some truth there. Hmm. Does anyone else have anything else they want to contribute to that question? Any thoughts? Okay. Question 11. What is question 11? Um, yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot to this question, depending on which way you go. So, when assessing the potential for an organization to do in situ conservation research, what sort of questions should be addressed? Annabeth.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay. So I hope I interpreted this question correctly. So there is a ton of things that you have to take into consideration if an organization wants to take part in situ research. So I put down like their capabilities to actually do the research. Are they trained? Do they have an appropriate amount of equipment and crew to do that? And ways to deal with the public about it as well, and education. do they have basically, do they have the potential or the capabilities to actually make this happen, or is it going to become some sort of conservation failure?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I agree. That's definitely one aspect of that. There's there's a bunch. Does anybody have any other things that they want to add on to that? Tiffany.
The author had mentioned that SHED specifically has two things they like to focus on, and that's if the program aligns with their collection and featured ecosystems, and whether or not it offers a story that is accessible, inspiring, and meaningful for the general public, which I found kind of silly. They do focus then on a later question that you shouldn't just focus on the really great stories. Um, but it was interesting that they literally had that as one of the biggest components to whether or not they wanted to do a conservation research program.
Yeah. Yeah. Zoo. Are you all right, Tiffany? You have a cold?
It's my asthma. I'm just losing my voice.
Oh, okay. Just checking. Uh, okay. Yep. Yeah, and that particular point, I mean, we talked earlier in the semester about how zoos love their PR stuff. And so yeah, I can see how doing an assessment like this, be like, can we take any really, like good photos of someone standing by a dolphin to put on a billboard somewhere because that's going to be a win. It's a win for them and for us. And so yeah, I can see that. See if we have anything else. Some of these things are rather simple things, I will say. There are so many things. So the scale of the study. A single institution, for example, may not be able to handle a very broad scaled question. There's something that requires, say, uh, looking over very broad geographical ranges. Or even you could look at scales of time and look over very long periods of time. That's just something, can my organization do this? In which case, you may need to start tapping into those conservation constellations we talked about at right, building collaborative networks up. And what other individuals can I bring in on this to allow us to succeed? What other institutions can I bring in on this? Where is it? So, many times it's a silly question, but I mean, just as an example, there are lots of birds all over the world that I think are really cool and I would love to study. But at the end of the day, when a grad student comes here and says, I want to work on birds, I don't send them to South America to study the Andean cock of the rock because it's not here. It's down there. I pick things that are within a region that I can reasonably get them to, right? Not that you can't do that, there are sometimes opportunities and funding available to send people to more exotic places, but in general, I choose to study things that are within my relative proximity. So that's a big question to ask. Yeah, Bjorn.
Something that I also really like, and I think someone might have mentioned this, but um, they talked briefly about identifying like the unique attributes about that institution and how that pairs with certain species. And I think that's such a cool aspect to consider when deciding what species to work on, because like when it comes down to it, if you kind of narrow down the list and have a list of really critical threatened species that are kind of within your area, figuring out what makes your institution different from others and how that might apply to the conservation, I think is really cool. And I think that also comes into play with the next chapter when they were talking about like, maybe each institution can focus on like one species. I can see that kind of applying in this sense as well. It's like if one institution has, a ship, the capabilities of that institution are, much, much broader than, someone who doesn't.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. Um, Another simple one. These are some of these are very straightforward, but they're things that would be need to be assessed. The availability of money. No one said, like, how much money do I have? If this project's going to cost $30 million and I've got $50, I can't do it. Like those are kind of things that you have to think about. Um, I like this one. The ability to provide valuable learning and training to stakeholders, I think, was an important one that no one mentioned. And ultimately, and we've talked about this a couple times now, the probability of success, or what we call triage, amongst a pool of options, which options are most likely to be successful options. Um, these are some of the other, there's other things as well in here, but those are some of the things. Okay. Uh, it's 8:01. Let's take our break now tonight. I'm going to go see if the world blew up because it's 8 o'clock Eastern. And as many of you know, uh, bad things are supposed to be happening right now. Um, and see you in 10 minutes. So at 11 after, 12 after is fine. Right, welcome back. The good news is we didn't blow up part of the planet, so that's good news. Okay, Jasmine's still not back. Give her a minute. Oh, there she is. Okay. Um, Question 12. How can having a diverse portfolio of research programs on different animals be of benefit over a single charismatic species? Abby.
A mixed portfolio of research programs can broaden opportunities to discuss organizational research. I have, for an example, the Shedd Aquarium works with a variety of charismatic species, including the Nassau grouper and the Arapaima. Both species serve as conservation flagships while also acting as gateways to discuss the need for sustainable fisheries and habitat preservation.
Okay, good. So offers sort of a diverse way to be able to talk about what you're doing. That's good. Oh, what else? Was there anything else that might? Yep, right.
Um, the book also mentioned that charismatic species could be used as, I believe they called it a hook, to generate interest. And I thought that was pretty interesting because we generally are like, boo, charismatic species. They take up all the resources, but they are also kind of tools to get resources for other animals. And um, I think earlier we talked about how protecting pandas, whom I'm a certified panda hater, but by protecting them and protecting their habitats, you're also protecting the other species related. And it's interesting to think about how that pertains to like a zoo aspect, how if I'm maybe showing off this one really cool species, how can that also boost the other species that I'm exhibiting as well, that I'm participating in conservation with?
Okay, yeah, sure. Um, what else? So remember the focus is on why having a diverse portfolio might be better than a focused portfolio. So what other reasons might might there be?
Can I add something to mine?
Yeah, you can
Sorry,
absolutely.
I wanted to say I meant like the zoo having all of these other programs or like having the resources available for them, but highlighting their charismatic species. So they do have a diverse photo, but to obtain resources for those other programs, they might use their charismatic species as a tool to help out the rest of their portfolio.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no, that's okay. Yeah, absolutely. I understand what you're saying. Absolutely. Um, other thoughts? What about from a zoo education perspective? Taylor.
It wasn't mentioned in the book, but I was kind of thinking that maybe it could interest more people. Like if there's some people that are interested in a specific animal, and you're only focusing on one, and that's not the animal they're interested in, maybe they're not going to come and like learn about it. But if you have like several, you'll appeal to more people.
Yeah. So in that same line of thinking, you're talking about appealing to visitors, I believe. Is there anyone else that you really want to be appealing to as many of as possible? Tiffany.
PhDs, so as many species as you have, that's the more actual programs you could do, and then also stakeholders.
Yeah, I was going towards stakeholders, but yeah, also potentially researchers. Uh, you people who are going to give you money. That's right. And visitors are one of those people. But when we're talking about large single lump sum types of donations and things, support for large projects, uh, some stakeholders might see a diverse portfolio of conservation projects as a more attractive proposition than just dumping even more money into this one charismatic thing. And so that's something that you have to think about as well. Now, what about, is there any benefit from a zoo education perspective or a conservation education perspective? Bjorn.
I think one thing that like having multiple species, especially if they're a part of the same ecosystem, I think sometimes it's easier to highlight habitats in general instead of just the one particular species. So when you have that diverse array, you can talk about habitat and environmental protection and why that is important for all animal communities, and yeah, as a whole.
Yeah, so having multiple organisms to represent the rainforest or whatever. Sure. Going along with that, you mentioned communities. The other thing you can highlight much better in an educational sense is the connectedness of all of those organisms, right? How ecosystems function on a connected level, and because they do. If you have all of these different animals that you could be like, look, this animal, you know, in a wild setting, we would eat that animal, right? And that's how energy flows through this system. But that animal, it eats that tree that we have planted over there. You can literally show things like food webs and other forms of connectivity that exist within ecosystems. So there's a very practical benefit from an educational standpoint. Okay. Question 13. This is kind of an interesting one. So why is there such a need for in situ conservation research projects to provide training and educational resources to conservation stakeholders? And it gives a couple examples in the book, I know. It took all semester, but this was the stumper, huh? That's a Tiffany.
Uh, so a lack of infrastructure, educational resources, and chances for professional development are seen as critical obstacles to developing the capacity to manage biodiversity in less developed countries. So developing the knowledge and skills of people and organizations is recognized as an important element in implementing conservation globally.
Yeah. So this training and the educational resources that they're talking about, depending on where you're at in the world, we take for granted, maybe to some extent, that right now we can all sit down in this classroom over Zoom and have this conversation and learn this stuff, right? It's not like that everywhere in the world. There are these developing countries where this would be an unimaginable privilege to be able to do this. That's an unfortunate reality in some of those situations. And we can be grateful for that while also recognizing that that's a big limitation for conservation in those countries. So if you want to have conservation biologists, you have to train them. You have to give them the education. And you have to start doing that preferably at a fairly young age. Um, you know, training someone my age, if I had no idea about conservation and someone, I'm 40 years old. If someone now was like, I'm going to teach you about conservation, I think I'd be like, oh, that's okay. I'm good. Like I'm 40. It's too late. I'm halfway to death now. Like I'm good. But like if you can get to someone that's in like they talk about like training high school students to help on these projects, for example, uh, you can start to create a future generation of conservation biologists. And but they need those resources. They need help getting those resources to overcome these hurdles in these countries. Uh, so does that make sense to everyone? I think it's a pretty important thing to think about. We have a very limited perspective on all of this stuff because we live in a country where whether or not you agree with everything going on in our country right now or not, we are still very privileged in many, many ways that other countries are not. And it's something to keep in mind. Okay. Uh, I think we can probably skip. We'll just talk about it real briefly. Question 14. We've talked about the triage and the idea of triage several times, so I don't want to talk too much about it. But how does SHED apply triage to its decision-making process? Jasmine.
SHED evaluates the conservation urgency of engaging in a program relative to the threat facing the targeted asset. Actions that provide the greatest benefit to biodiversity persistence are higher priorities. If a species population habitat would likely persist without a particular action, the intervention will have a lower net biodiversity.
Is that just straight from the book? Okay, I was like, that sounds like you're reading that paragraph straight from the book. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so the big things are what are the overall biodiversity benefits? What is the probability of success, right? And what is the cost? Those are the big things. It's cost benefit analysis, ultimately. That's what triage is. Um, Question 15, I think, is a bit more important at this point. How does SHED perform annual evaluations of their conservation programs? Because one of the things we've talked about is how zoos are really, really bad at evaluating what they're doing. This is not a skill zoos are particularly adept at. And how zoos aren't particularly introspective a lot of the time. So what do? What does SHED do? Bjorn.
They basically just set their own annual objectives. And so they measure their success based on whether or not they were able to meet their goals every year. So it's an annual thing. And I can't remember when they said they actually like come up with those objectives, which I'd be very curious about. Like I don't know if they also do that annually based on, what has happened in the previous years, or if it's like, a 5 or 10 year plan where they're like every year we want to make these goals happen. So I'm not sure how they do that, but I know that they said that they have, annual goals, and that's basically what they're basing their success off of.
Yeah, that's a good point, Bjorn, about they don't talk about whether they do an annual goal setting and then an annual assessment of those goals, or whether they have, like you said, a 5 year plan or something like that. But they do talk about the goals being scalable, meaning you can tweak the numbers within a goal if that's necessary, which is both good and also problematic because you can kind of cheatsy your success by lowering certain numbers in your goal. Um, but yeah, at least there's some form of assessment happening, right? Like I set these goals. Can I put a check mark by these goals? Did I, what percentage of these things was I able to accomplish? And and so some assessment is better than what I feel like the no assessment that some zoos and aquariums do. I think this could be, if nothing else, without knowing more details about how they exactly do this, it could at minimum be a good starting point if you were wanting to design a way to assess your own um, program. Interestingly, uh, all of your teachers have to do this exact same process every single year, and we do it annually. It's called faculty performance review. We set our own goals for ourselves, and then, as I have to do by this Friday, we then tell our boss whether or not we met all the goals, and we have to do a big write-up about that. But it is a way to assess whether or not you're doing the things that you state that you're going to do every year. So as much as I hate it, it's probably a necessary evil. Uh, yeah, Ryan.
Okay, well, I kind of had my finger on it, like, because I was maybe gonna raise my hand, but now I guess I have to. Um, I wanted to add to that by saying that the shed aquarium like focused specifically on inputs and outputs, but I feel like did Bjorn kind of already explain that part? I don't know. I'm gonna explain it again, I guess. The inputs and outputs. So like rather than like, did I get this goal? How much did I actually make it to this goal? They were like, well, on the way, what did I contribute? What did I get from that? Like, how does that rude? How does that contribute to my goal? And I thought that was a very in-depth way of evaluating rather than just like, did I get the goal? Did I not? Did I kind of get the goal? It was like more specific on what they actually were putting into the overall project, I guess. So I liked how they did that.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a good point as well. Yeah, you could do it more superficially and just be like, got it. Right. But yeah, so it's a little more in depth, and that's good. Okay. Question 16. It's 8:30. What we got? We have plenty of time. Okay. We'll talk about question 16. So we talked about considerations for projects. Question 16 is about considerations for staff. So if you are choosing staff members, let's say you're in a position where you're hiring for a project, for example, what staff considerations need to be made? What does Shed think about when they're doing that? Tiffany.
Uh, one of the important ones that I really liked is that um, they have to be able to speak effectively to a general audience, to disseminate results using various approaches, and to work interdepartmentally on multiple projects. So there is kind of, I've seen it myself, where research scientists have a hard time giving the information they're learning or working on to just a layman, where they're so used to talking amongst themselves that they have a hard time not necessarily dumbing it down, but making it digestible by other audiences. So I think that was a really important aspect they touched upon that I think a lot of places don't actually think about.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's one of the most important things in this entire list, particularly when you're talking about someplace like a zoo, where you're going to have to talk to people with varying levels of education at varying ages, from little kids to other research scientists, right? All the way through that spectrum, and being able to communicate at the level that's appropriate to those individuals is important. Uh, and actually, I had made it a point that I wanted to talk about that exact thing tonight because you are all grad students. And I'm telling you right now, your ability to communicate is so very important. It's one of the most important things that you can learn. The better you are at communicating, the more successful you will be. You do not have to be like an absolute genius at whatever you are studying to be good at it. But if you cannot communicate what what you've studied and what you've learned, then and both in writing and in speech actually, uh, then there's just not much point. You must be able to communicate. Um, I think Tiffany had mentioned working in an interdisciplinary capacity, right? The type of work that we all do, unless you just want to go off and be a keeper and never touch a conservation project ever in your life, the type of work you do in conservation biology is highly interdisciplinary. It requires individuals from multiple disciplines coming together and contributing their expertise to accomplish something. And we've talked about that maybe without you realizing it many times this semester when we talk about collaborations and these conservation constellations and the the fact that zoos represent a very specific point of expertise in a collaboration, often related to animal husbandry, right? Um, it's not like we can just have zoos that are really good at animal husbandry and achieve conservation. That by itself is not enough. We need the experts in things like population genetics. We need the experts that understand the natural histories of these animals and the experts that know how to research those things when that information doesn't already exist. It takes a broad variety of expertise to achieve a conservation goal. And so that's very, very important. If you're not willing, if you're like, I just want to go take care of my animals and that's what I want to do, and you're not willing to work with these other folks and maybe learn a little from these other folks as well, you're doing the wrong thing. That's that's what I would say. Obviously, experience. Every hiring place everywhere on the planet thinks you should already be hired with like you shouldn't be hired till you already have experience. It's like that whole like weird uh how can I get experience if every place that wants to hire for an entry level position wants experience? It's but experience of course is important. Um you know your education is important. These discussions are important. They're valuable. But actually going and doing is the most valuable thing at the end of the day. Going out and getting in the field and doing the work, whatever that looks like, or maybe not in the field. I work in the field. For you all, it might be going and working in the zoo, but like getting that experience, that's critical. Good. I think that covers that pretty well. I think it's important to think about those things too, because these are, if you want to get hired, these are the sorts of things that you want to be trying to emphasize in your, whether it's an application or in a conversation you're having with someone who represents a potential position somewhere, you want to emphasize your ability to do these things. I think one thing that maybe the book, I don't think the book talks about this, um, but enthusiasm, just in general, your enthusiasm is so important. Yes, Cleo.
I was just about to say, just being like passionate about what you're
Mm.
doing. Sorry, I just fell out of my chair. Uh, but like showing that you're passionate is really important in like interviews and stuff, I feel like.
Yeah, absolutely. If you come into the interview and you've got like rocking credentials, but you just don't really seem to care, that's going to be a big problem. Uh, I would rather, I mean, not all folks on hiring committees are like me, but I would much rather take uh, maybe a less experienced person that's highly passionate and driven than, you know, the opposite of that, personally. Tiffany.
I think what comes with the enthusiasm and passion is a clear sign that you are willing to learn. So especially in this field, um, you're going most of your knowledge is cool, but you're going to be learning on the job. So if you're coming in and you think you know everything, that's very much a turn off. That we want to be able to know that you are going to come in expecting to learn a whole lot and that we've been here and we know how to teach you. So that's, I think, also where the enthusiasm comes in.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Ryan.
Yeah, along with that, I kind of feel like because I'm a zookeeper and I've been a full-time keeper for about 3 years, and so they call me just the baby zookeeper there, but like I I feel like enthusiasm and as Tiffany was talking about earlier, just like the ability to talk to people, stuff like that. That's like a major, major part of what you do on a conservation aspect because I've come to realize, or I mean, I kind of always knew, but like as a keeper working here in Omaha, Nebraska, like, am I really doing that much for conservation? Like, I know, compared to someone who's out in the field, who's like putting forth research and doing stuff like that, it's minimal compared to that, or at least you can scale it differently. And so, talking to the public and being enthusiastic and showing that you care, which is then kind of helping other people build connections, like that's how you contribute to conservation, especially in this field. So I personally have a lot of big frustrations with keepers who don't want to do that part because then cool, you're keeping the animals alive and you're doing the husbandry part, but are you doing a conservation part? No. So I actually in my building am one of the very few people who I love to go out and I will just yap, yap, yap about monkeys. But even today I had a buddy and his 5-year-old kid come to the zoo and I got a whole 2-paragraph text message about how personalized their experience felt, how good of a time they had, and how good of a time the kid had, and stuff that the kid was saying on the way home. I'm like, that's me doing my part in the best way I can. If I can't be in the field, tracking spider monkey poop left and right, and like putting forth research or at least some other larger contribution, if I can't give you all my money, then I can at least do that. So I think that's really major. I probably went on a rant there, but I love that we brought that up.
No, that was a good rant to go on. I don't really think it was a rant at all. Um, and good job. I'm proud of you. I'm gonna start bragging about my student who's actually willing to reach out and teach about some conservation, that wants to do it. That's
If
good.
any of you find yourselves in Omaha, Nebraska, hit me up. I Find me. I would love to give you guys a tour. Come feed a hippo or just learn about our building. It's so cool. I think Caitlin, you've been there before, but come back. It's pretty cool. I would love to talk your guys' ears off.
Come feed a hippo. Is that really on the table?
Pygmy hippo, but
That's
hippo
cool. That's
nonetheless.
that's totally fine. I will find a way.
Can we get a West Liberty vehicle for that?
Well, I
Big
probably,
hippo.
yeah.
Do you guys still have Arapaima in the jungle?
Yeah, they're the coolest animal in the entire zoo, and I actually talked about them a lot with that little kid today because he thought they were the coolest things. Except one of them accidentally hit one of the pacu in that pool, and homie's been swimming upside down. But I last I heard he's okay now. But the Arapaima, our biggest, is probably like almost 7 feet. I don't know how much they weigh. They're so cool.
They are cool, yeah. It's amazing. Uh, all right. So I wrote down I'm going to feed a pygmy hippo probably this summer. So just so you know, Taylor.
I think, like everyone's saying, passion is really important. And I think something to consider when you have passion is being able to navigate conflict professionally. Because when you're really passionate about something, you have some big opinions and, you get really excited about it. But some people like don't necessarily take it that way, especially when you think differently. I think that's something that I've seen in like my workplace a lot of the time. Like people like they really feel a certain way about something, but being able to like put your maybe like your judgments aside and being able to collaboratively work together is really important as well. Because like I think when I get really excited about something, I have a harder time listening. So just keeping that in mind, like passion is definitely good, and also being able to like incorporate the communication in there is also really important.
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the like such common reference questions, if someone calls like me for a reference, for example, will be like something along the lines of, "How did so and so work on a team? Did they work well with others?" Something like that. That's like such a common question. Um, yeah, and if you can't like keep it together when you have a disagreement, that's really not good. And I don't lie in references. Like I tell the truth. If I'm like, yeah, this person's unhinged, they're good at this, this, and this, and they're really bad at that. They're not going to hire you. Like that's that's the reality. Um, so it's hugely important. It's also just from just a perspective of just being a person. It's pretty beneficial to be able to put your differences aside, just listen to someone. And if you don't agree with someone, you don't have to agree with them. Just don't blow a gasket over it, right? Like there are reasonable ways to disagree with people, and then there's going crazy. Those are different. Okay. We're gonna skip that one. Let's go to question 18. What was learned and decided? So I like this chapter a lot. Um, I feel like this is where Annabeth is going to have some things to say tonight because this is frog chapter. Annabeth might blow my mind with frog knowledge here. I'm excited. So let's start with question 18 though, which is pretty straightforward. What was learned and decided from the study by this person in 2008? Tiffany.
So I have to say, at my last facility for over 8 years, I have heard it's Gagliardo,
That's what I figured.
Gagliardo's voice, because they have a video talking about amphibian arc and all that stuff. So over and over again, Gagliardo's voice is stuck in my head forever now. Also, a French dub of his voice is also stuck in my head. Um, don't recommend listening to Frog Facts in French. It's very interesting, but hard to listen to. Um, but what he found out in this initial study was that the species that were being kept most predominantly as pets and in zoo exhibits were not good proxies for these diverse species in lower Central America. Their care was not even close to what we needed to do. And then there was just challenges of diplomacy, logistics, and animal health that really dictated captive surveillance assurance colonies should probably be more developed in their range countries as instead of in facilities outside of their range.
Good. Yep. So just so everyone is on the same page here, what does that mean as proxies? What does that mean?
I can go
Go
if
ahead.
that's okay.
Yeah,
Um,
just
just because they're like say if you know how to take care of a white tree frog, that doesn't mean you're going to know how to take care of another tree frog from a different country. So
good.
you can't just use this one size fits all husbandry.
Good. Yeah. I just want to make sure everybody understood what that means. Yeah, that's exactly right. Okay. Um, what do we think about? I'm trying to think if there's anything that we should pull out of that. What do we think about the idea, or what is the justification for saying that these assurance colonies should be in the countries of their home ranges? I think that's. Oh, Taylor, go ahead.
I just have a quick question. So, are there laws that say like these frogs can't come into other countries? Because like at zoos, you do see a lot of foreign species. Or is it just like specific like species that can't come in, or is it like only? Does it only have to do with like the projects they're involved in? It's like, oh, you can have them, but they're not involved in the projects. Like I'm kind of confused on like what like the rules and like the laws or like the recommendations are.
Yeah, there are. Caitlin, do you want to talk? Are you responding to Taylor? Yep, go ahead.
Okay, not frogs specifically, but amphibians. I think for some of the like Asian salamanders, there is now some sort of disease that could be comparable to chytrid. So now, like, you can't bring these Asian salamanders to the United States. And I only know that because I worked in the amphibian department for a little bit. And we have some salamanders that are not popular in zoos, and we have no way to get more because there are restrictions because of some sort of disease that could be brought over and impact salamander populations. I want to say its abbreviation is like BSAL or something like that, but it's kind of in the same vein as chytrid that's talked about in this chapter. So like there are regulations about that sort of thing, but I don't know how many apply to frogs specifically.
Good. Tiffany, you have some.
Uh, Caitlin was talking specifically about fire-belly newts. They're the biggest carriers of B-Sal that we have found so far. They are non-symptomatic, but they are massive shedders. So they are actually considered injurious species in the United States. I think fire-belly toads are also up there. I don't know if they've stopped the import. You can get them as captive pets. But for frogs specifically, but most amphibians, some of them are CITES. So CITES will stop the import and export of some of these species. For example, the tomato frogs are a CITES 1. True tomato frogs, not the false tomatoes frogs. There has because I kind of thought it was interesting that they did bring up the diplomacy fact. I did look at the original article. For example, Josh's Frogs is a really good private. You can buy amphibians from them and other animals, but they do a lot of great work in conservation. A problem right now, specifically in captive populations, is, for example, the Azurius poison dart frog. All of our captive lines are now inbred, and we are having trouble breeding them. And we think it's due to the inbreeding that diplomacy factors and things like that have actually stopped imports of Newfounder lines. So even things like they aren't necessarily protected by CITES, but the government themselves has stopped the export of these species. That it had nothing to do with law. It was just diplomacy in general, which can happen in a lot of places. And it's not necessarily the people that want them, it's the people we are asking to get the species from.
Good answer. Yeah. Um, I think I had a question, but I don't remember what it was. I don't remember now. That's okay. All right. Question 19 should draw some interesting discussion, I believe. Has the ARC program been a success or failure? And explain why you think that. Jasmine Anders.
I said that I believe it was both. I mean, it was a success that it got people thinking about amphibians more and helped educate the public on what was happening to amphibians in the wild and and like ways that they could help with it. It was a failure in that it didn't get much accomplished after this when it comes to ex situ and in situ conservation, primarily in zoos contribution.
Okay. Okay, Annabeth.
Um, I think that even though in the text it said it was labeled as a failure because it just didn't meet numbers, I think that it did draw attention and it did cause some positive impact, especially about the education of Chytrid. And I know that they did the 2008 Year of the Frog, and I think that was successful because it definitely got people thinking about frogs. Um, so I think that even though it didn't meet expectations, it still did something, and I think that's positive. So I think it should be labeled as a success, but that's just how I think about it. Like I think any little contribution is a success in that case. It's not like we went into the negatives. It just didn't meet expectations.
Okay, that's fair. Tiffany.
Uh, I went the complete opposite. I think it's a resounding failure. Um,
Okay.
and maybe this is just as someone who has cared for dozens of species of frogs, including the Panamanian golden frog. Um, the entire point was that there was the sheer breadth of species we were losing. They identified 196 species. Only 55 of them actually made it into a program, let alone it didn't even say if those were necessarily successful programs, just that they were brought in to programs. So we didn't even get half of the potential species that needed to be saved. This isn't just that they were threatened, they're like literally close to extinction at this point. I'm pretty sure we have lost species now by since this has been published. I think there has been a few species that we have deemed probably extinct because we can't find them anymore, or at least functionally extinct in the wilds now. Um, and I think the whole point was that, yeah, you only need to bring in one species. And so many facilities didn't even do that much. And there's still such a massive imbalance between frog programs and bird and mammal programs that I don't feel like the point really hit home. I feel like they acknowledged it and ruminated a little bit and then just kind of let it fly by. I don't feel like the information stuck. I'm still telling people that amphibians are some of the most endangered species, groups of species, and there's not as much work that came out of it as probably should have. So I feel like that's kind of one of the really bad negatives that came out of this project is it showed how unwilling some of these facilities were to do what they said should have been very small space, little resources compared to other animals. It should have been feasible for so many facilities, and they just didn't do it.
Yeah, okay. I think that's cool. We had two conflicting perspectives. Bjorn, you're the tiebreaker. Not really. I'm just kidding. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Tiffany was saying. I was definitely thinking more along those lines as well. And I think one thing that really bothered me about what the book was saying was that like a lot of these AZA institutions, they didn't just like ruminate on this, but it said that they like, excuse me, it said that they like broadcasted the message and broadcasted the fact that they were actually going to step up and stuff. And it seemed almost like they utilized it as just another platform to gain attention, but then nobody did anything about it. So it seemed like it was like this big hurrah and it was gaining momentum, and then everything just completely died. And so it's I think it would have been one thing for me if like the institutions came together and they talked about and say, hey, like this is not really feasible, but we can make like a long-term plan, even if we lose some species along the way. Like that would, I mean, really, really suck, but at least we'd be like moving somewhere. And it felt like with this, the way the book described it, it was moving somewhere and then it just completely stopped. Like zoos were like, yes, we're gonna do this, it's gonna be great. And then when the time came to actually do it, they were just like hands off.
okay. Uh, Cleo.
I just wanted to add in that I thought the craziest stat from like all of this was that 70% of the zoos still did not like acquire a plan or plan to acquire anything, even after like all the publicity and stuff.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's problematic for sure. All right, I'm gonna let Annabeth rebut before you go, Tiffany. All right. Or just say whatever Annabeth wants to say.
I just don't. I'm trying to think of reasons why they didn't develop a plan. Because was it just because there was lack of interest in holding amphibians? Um, or because, it did talk about, how a lot of them are not really most charismatic thing in the world. Or was it lack of resources? Because if it was a lack of resources thing, then there should have been a plan about like obtaining resources so then they could house those amphibians and properly make programs for them. Um, because if there's not enough people trying to back that up, then it's was probably not a very well established like directive in the first place. Like we have this goal, but like is that goal actually feasible with what resources is available? That's just where my mind is going.
Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe they should have assessed the project like Shed, right? Maybe a little bit. It'll be on a much larger scale, of course, but yeah, it's a good point. Tiffany, you had something you want to say?
Uh, Kind of going off of that, I don't know if anyone has ever looked into how many SSPs and safes there are for amphibians. There is an embarrassingly low number. So I feel like if this had really hit home, there would have been more species that actually would have had specific programs. We have the Panamanian golden frog, both of its species. I've only ever worked with Zedeke, but it's interesting because I've looked at a lot of this background information for Panamanian golden frogs in specific, that they literally said you only need a shipping container. That's all you need. And they're not, it just needs to have airflow and all this kind of stuff. So I felt like they had literally set up all these facilities for such an easy success. And it kind of just came back to well, it wasn't originally part of their collection plan and they had other things they wanted first and that they thought would bring in more money that they decided, oh, we'll do that later, but there is no later for a lot of these species at this point because of chytrid fungus. That Amphibian Arca kind of did a lot of the planning for them. They just had to implement it. And so many of these, I don't know if it was boards that didn't want to do it. I don't know if it was stakeholders, if it was just directors and stuff like that, that just didn't follow through, which I feel is a shame.
Yeah, it is. Taylor.
Like when I was reading this, I was kind of debating whether it was like the program that was unsuccessful or it was like the zoos that dropped the ball on this one. Because like Tiffany was saying, I feel like they presented a lot of the stuff that they needed. It was almost like kind of like handed to them on how to do this, you know what I mean? And they made it as easy as possible. I think the program itself did pretty well and it's like planning and things like that. But like they didn't hit their numbers. It was like less than 30% were taken in, but I feel like this was a big reflection on zoos and their favoritism and their uh, habit of trying to like jump on the bad bandwagon almost and just kind of say like, hey, we do this, you know, kind of like what Bjorn was talking about, and then just like not follow through. So like I think the zoos deserve more criticism than like the program itself.
Okay. Um, yeah, Ryan.
I just have a clarifying question. I'm not super in depth with amphibians and chytrid. If you, geez, I'm sorry, my cats are going crazy. Um, Chytrid is obviously a major factor in the decline of amphibians in the wild, and I know in the book they even state that it's one of the main reasons why they're not putting these frogs back in the wild because they're like they're just gonna die. But from just the quick searches I've done, there's really not a lot of progress in finding ways to manage chytrid in the wild. And is that something that you, and this is more my clarifying question, is that a disease or a fungi that will leave an area eventually? Do you think it'll like die out or it's there forever? And if it's there forever, this might be coming out of left field, but overall, what is keeping these assurance populations within zoos going to do for the population? I think someone kind of touched on this a little bit, but if we don't have this, we talked about it in other chapters too, but if we don't have a means to get them back to their natural habitats, their natural populations, and there's nothing we can do about it, then why keep those species? Why not focus on maybe other species that are putting up with the disease a bit better and focusing on stuff like that? And I love the frogs, guys. Don't think I'm a frog hater. I love the frogs. I have a frog tattoo. But yeah, it just, I'm like, what are you keeping them for? Will they then just live out the rest of their lives in a glass box like they talked about in this chapter as well? Um, if anyone can answer those Kitrid questions for me, I feel I would be more well-rounded.
Okay. Tiffany, go ahead.
Uh, so Chytrid is treatable in captivity. Uh, you can actually prevent it. I think it's, oh, I forget them. I've used the medication before for them, to treat plants and stuff. Since the publication of this book, the Golden Frog Project, they have a pretty significant breeding program in Panama for PGF. One of their most recent projects within the last, I think, 5 years is actually a small area of the forest they have set aside where they are releasing captive bred PGFs and they are testing their resistance to chytrid fungus. And they have actually found some pretty good results. Now, this is only with, I think it's with Zedecky. I don't know if it's both, and it might be Zedecky sora. I don't entirely know. Um, but at this point, we're kind of being like, well, you can't treat chytrid fungus in the wild because what you treat it for in captivity is an antifungal. You can't put an antifungal in the environment. Fungi are important. Like we can't get rid of them. You can't just do chytrid. That's we haven't figured that out yet. So now it's kind of gotten to the point where can we up their resistance? Are they going to be able to now work around it since we can't get rid of it? And I think so far the results are pretty promising. They're not fantastic, but we're kind of getting more towards that way.
Tiffany, do you know on that particular project, when they're looking at resistances, are they doing a selective breeding program with resistant individuals?
I can't remember if it's selective breeding or if they're giving them small doses so they're not getting like if they're infected, they can fight it off so they're gaining immunity. I can't
Hmm,
remember exactly I think it's more the immunity aspect than the selective breeding.
gotcha. I was thinking about what is it? American chestnut. I think they've like an American chestnut suffers from chestnut blight. There's very few American chestnuts left, and so one of the pers heavily leaned on prospects for them to survive is in lineages that are resistant to the blight and in sort of supporting and breeding those plants more. So I wondered if it was something similar because I'm not familiar with that. So, Caitlin, you have your hand raised.
Another argument for keeping them still in these glass boxes is like we are still learning more about them. I'm going to minimize you just so I can read this text about it from my former boss, and hopefully you can still hear me and yell at me if you can't. But basically, at our zoo, we have Atelopus varius and Atelopus zetechi, and we partnered with a university, and they did these like stress tests, kind of. So I'm going to read you this text. So they looked at immune response of Atelopus at varying temps, and there's something called a thermodynamic curve that drops off at certain temps. And in a nutshell, it seemed like A. varius had a higher temp tolerance and maintained a higher immune response at higher temps than Zetechi. And incidentally, varius still exists in the wild while Zetechi does not. So we would need to like obviously replicate that study more for it to be worthwhile, but we are still learning more things about them that could overall impact their survival back in the wild. Like maybe learning about this stress test will tell us like why one is more equipped to withstand the environmental stressors than the other.
Thank you for that. That's interesting information. Certainly has uh, some implications for climate shift on response, potentially. That's really interesting. Um, Someone else had their hand raised. Someone dodged me, and I don't. It was Bjorn. It was Bjorn. Bjorn, did you want to add something? No. Okay.
No,
Fine.
I don't think I really have anything valuable to add. I was really happy to hear that. Thank you, Tiffany and Caitlin, for kind of clearing that up a little bit and talking about the projects, because that was one thing the book mentioned was that there's like so many of these frogs now in captivity that they're just like actively culling them because they just keep reproducing and they don't know what to do with it. So that was like my first thought when I was reading the book. It was like, well, I mean, why don't we start, exposing them to Kitrid, which sounds really, really harsh, but it's like if you're calling them anyway, doing that, you might find a line that's resistant. So it's just awesome to hear that they're already actively doing that and they're actually doing it in Panama. It's really cool. So
Caitlin.
Oh, I just wanted to add that like this is a really cool study that we did, but it was a very classic zoo example of like my boss and his the people in his department all had to jump through 1,000 hoops to get this study done because you are using like a zoo successioned animal and you have to make sure everything's humane and is the stress worth it and is it worthwhile. So like while that study was really beneficial and I would like to see things like that in zoos, like it was not easily done. And for non-amphibian people, when I say Atelopus, that's the same thing as PGF or Panamanian golden frog. Like we're all talking about the same type of frog.
Yeah, I mean, in the academic world, we have similar hoops to jump through. We have to justify anytime we work with animals, all the sort of ethical things and why we're doing the methods we're doing, and if there's less invasive methods. So I understand the red tape problem that comes with doing animal research. It's, it's just there. Uh, I don't love it either. I just want to do what I'm going to do. Like, let me try to help this thing, right? Like, I don't need to fill out a bunch of paperwork, but that's what we do. Tiffany.
This is kind of a question for Caitlin, but in the US, I don't know if anyone else knows this, the majority of the Atelopus, at least Zedeки, are actually owned by Maryland Zoo, because they pretty much have the majority of all of the Atelopus ever bred in the US. Caitlin, is your group owned by your facility, or are they on loan from Maryland?
I actually don't know, but I
Okay,
wouldn't be totally surprised if we did own some of them,
okay,
just because, like, at Detroit, we've had the National Amphibian Conservation Center
that's
since
right.
I
That's true.
think 2000. So I think, like, from the beginning, we've been pretty invested. I shouldn't say at the beginning, but for a while now, as amphibians have gotten more attention, we've been very invested in amphibians. So I wouldn't be surprised if we own them, but we might not. They might still be on loan.
I was gonna say, because they're really bad. I've had to contact Maryland being like, hey, one of your frogs died. What do you want me to do with it? And never got any information back. So I can't imagine the hoops, even more hoops they'd have to jump through because they couldn't get contact back from the actual owning facility.
Yeah, that's a good point. Um, I wanted to talk about something. So Ryan said something like, "What are we? Why are we even keeping them? Are they just going to live out their lives in glass boxes if we can't put them back in the wild?" And I think that's a really good question to uh, ruminate on for a minute. What do you all think about that question? Fine, leave. So what? Someone just bailed. Who just bailed?
I think Caitlin hit the wrong button.
Caitlin fails class. No, there she is. So what do we think about that though? Annabeth, I want to know specifically what you think about that.
What, to keep animals even though that
So
there's an excess?
let's frogs specifically. We're talking about frogs right now. So I
Yeah.
really want to touch at your heartstrings because I know your love for frogs is deep. Um, yeah, do you think keeping them just in captivity, if it is impossible to put them back in the wild, is good?
Whenever you say impossible, I think that's kind of not the right word because it's impossible currently, but we don't know future what that might look like. So I think having them as kind of a start for maybe future conservation projects is probably what the best to do with it. But
Mhm.
whenever like you have an excess and you need to start culling because you don't have any use for them. I mean, there still can be use, we talk about like necropsies and um I mean, you can even use their their deceased forms to do research with. There's always more to do. Um and also education purposes. So I don't think it's necessary. I mean, there is an excess and it's bad that we can't return them to their habitat because of chytrid, but there's still more to do. So that's kind of what my brain is thinking. I hope I answered your question.
You did, yeah. You hit very early on what I was personally thinking about. So good. I mean, you couldn't answer any of these questions wrong, right? That's not the point. But yeah. So it's a difficult thing because I'm not very much not a fan of like the idea of animals permanently in captivity that can never also be integrated into their natural environment. Um, but when you look at the scale of conservation statuses, you have extinct in the wild versus extinct, I guess I'd rather see extinct in the wild than just extinct, right? First off. Um, and, that's why that one comes slightly higher on the scale, right? It comes just a little bit before completely extinct because we think of that as a better thing, typically, though I can see arguments definitely in opposition to that. Um, that kind of goes back to I think some of the Wilder Kingdom earlier chapters talking about like uh, perspectives of animals in captivity and are they even really being animals, as they should be if they're in captivity, those sorts of things. Um, but Bjorn, go ahead.
I think from my perspective, another aspect to this is just the human pressures that we've been putting on these frogs as well. Like when we talk about chytrid, I feel like that dominates the conversation, and there's good reason for that because it's an epidemic. But a huge part of why so many frog species are at risk right now are because humans come in and we're destroying habitat left and right, and so much of what we do and the activities that we do, we're also really, really threatening these populations. And so for me, I feel like we almost have a responsibility to help protect these frogs as well, because a lot of the habitat restoration that will hopefully happen will probably open up doors as well for reintroductions. But it makes me feel like we have a little bit more of a responsibility versus it just being like, natural causes that come through. It's like we're also a really, really big part of the problem. And so this is just a way that we can kind of combat our own activities to help protect the species that we are also putting at risk.
Okay, yeah, I agree. There's multiple factors. I think the thing is until chytrid came along, many of these species, while they were a lot of them were challenged by human activity, weren't like just doomed outright, if that makes any sense. Chytrid really like was the nail in the coffin, if you will, and I think that's why it gets the brunt of the focus, and also because it's literally preventing us from even, in some cases, doing anything to try to reestablish them in the wild, like is the case in this chapter. Um, Cleo.
I think it's important to keep them, even if it is just in a glass box and they're extinct in the wild, just so we can continue to keep learning about them. And if they are breeding successfully, like the programs that Tiffany and Caitlin were talking about, it allows us to still continue to learn about them and have that potential to actually reintroduce them. So I think that there might be a positive from keeping them in a glass box that could potentially come out of it. We're just still learning about it.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Tiffany.
I think going further on what Cleo said about learning, I don't know if anyone's actually realized how few amphibian species are actually kept in facilities. I myself cared for, I think it was upwards of 22 species, and they were some of the most popular in facilities, mainly because they're easy to get and they're cheap. But also, the important thing is we know how to care for them. So I think one of the most important aspects is that even if, say, we cannot eventually save Atelopus, Panamanian golden frogs, whatever you want to call them, and release them into the wild, the more we learn about them, the better chance we have of saving the next species. That it might not have worked for this one, but the more we learn, the more resources we know we need, the more expertise we train into these people, the better chance we have of saving the next species, which at this point is kind of the most important thing. We're like, okay, we might be done. There might be not anything left to do for Atelopus sateki, but that next Atelopus species or something else, we have better knowledge, we have better testing, we have better ways of possibly saving this species instead. So the research aspect in the sense of helping another species, I feel, is probably the most important, and having people with the knowledge and the expertise of how to actually follow through with what we learn.
Yeah, that's absolutely. Taylor.
I definitely agree that it's important to like get this information and this research so we can help others, but instead of like focusing on a species that necessarily maybe can't, like has a low chance of being safe, why not get this information and this research and this expertise and these like skill sets with a species that like has more of a chance. You know what I mean? Instead of like getting the information from maybe a species that like will be kept in a box for a really long time versus like switching your attention to a species that's struggling, has a chance, and still being able to get that information. You know what I mean? Like you're still able to like learn about them, but you're focusing on a species that has more of a chance.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, oh, Ryan, go ahead.
Just another random thought, but I think lab techniques and like more of our genetic cloning stuff could become useful for this in a way that you maybe wouldn't need such large assurance populations or like facilities of holding like the physical animal. Like maybe you could do something like the biobank thing where you have resources, but just not in the form of a live animal. And then if our like cloning procedures and stuff are able to improve in the next however many years, then maybe that could be a good use of our resources for animals. Because as much as I completely agree with everyone, I still just feel like, and this is just me being soft at heart, I think, I just feel like it's sad that an animal or a certain species is not going to make it out of a box. Even if there's like potential for it, let's say there's like a very slim chance, not, I don't know amphibians specifically, but like it's just kind of sad. And I think science could be used as a good little placeholder for that as well. I just don't think we like technologically are there yet, but that also would bring up questions on like if you start mixing species in that way, like are you really introducing whatever blah 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 frog, or are you introducing a completely new species? How is that behavior gonna affect? Also being in captivity, breeding all these animals in captivity. I don't know about frogs. So like, do you think being bred in captivity and living in captivity would affect them behaviorally, being reintroduced into the wild for frogs specifically? Annabeth?
I don't think so.
Okay.
At
Well,
least with mine, my not to get on like a little rant, but my research frogs, I don't think that they can differentiate between what's going on at any point. They see my finger and they bite my finger. I think they'll be fine. Personally, I don't know about other frogs, just from the species that I've worked with. I think that they are fine. I think they would react in the same way.
No, as someone who's worked with dozens, yeah, they're all that dumb. They don't know what's happening.
That's interesting. Go on.
So I actually had a question since we have so many very knowledgeable frog people in this chat right now and people who've worked with them. Um, from my knowledge, there's like two species, and this might be very, very outdated knowledge, but there's two species that I know that are very widely resistant to the chytrid fungus. That's the American bullfrog and I think the African clawed frog. And I was wondering if you guys know of any, institutions or any research that's actually being done on those species instead of just like, protecting the ones that are not resistant. Is there any research going on those species to understand like why they're able to survive with these infections?
Yeah, Annabeth, go ahead.
Not sure, but I think a lot of that might just be because they've been around and been in the trade for so long. Like African clawed frogs, they used to be used for pregnancy tests. So they came over, they were distributed like in the 60s, maybe even before that. Um, so it might just be like a resistance thing where they've just been everywhere so much that they've developed that resistance before any of the others. Like, because a lot of what we have are probably new to like the pet trade or the international zoo trade. And so they haven't actually been exposed to that much. I don't know. I want to hear what Tiffany has to say.
Go ahead.
Um, I think one thing I want to point out is they're not necessarily resistant, they're asymptomatic. So a lot of the work that is going in with Xenos and bullfrogs is actually because they are invasive species, is stopping them because they are massive shedders. of chytrid, especially Xenos, into the water, African clawed frogs. Um, so it's not that they don't have it. They just don't show the symptoms of chytrid, which fire belly toads, I think, are another one. It's the fire belly toads and newts in Asia that really, because they evolved alongside it, they're asymptomatic but are massive shedders. And I think it's just something about Xenos and bullfrogs. It's most things, not even just chytrid. They are so hardy and they are so good at colonizing different areas that now it's not, I don't think there's much study on how they're asymptomatic. I don't even know if we know why they're asymptomatic compared to other species. It's stopping them from being introduced into novel areas that don't have chytrid yet, because they'll just shed it and shed it. And there's really no stopping it once it's introduced into an area.
So just with a very cursory search, there's so much research on this. It's crazy. There's just I found like a billion papers in 2 seconds. Yes, people were studying the bullfrog and chytrid fungus. People were studying the uh, palmate newt, which is not a newt that I'm familiar with. And apparently it is resistant as well. There's all this is so you could definitely write a book on chytrid fungus just from these papers. Um, just as an example, as you guys were talking, I skimmed this abstract. It's very interesting. Um, these researchers studied, there's apparently an eastern and western strain of chytrid fungus. And of course, in the western United States, bullfrogs are invasive, in the eastern United States, not. Um, and they looked at western bullfrogs exposed to both the western and eastern strain of chytrid, and they found that the bullfrogs in the west are actually very susceptible to the chytrid strains in the east. So there's a regional component to all of this as well, which is very interesting. Now, that's me reading an abstract in 12 seconds. Um, there must be a lot, there's tons of information, I think, out there to digest. So if it's something you're interested in, it is out there. And that makes sense because it's very important. That's a big, this is a big area of amphibian conservation uh, research right now. Um, if we, wow, I just like had a stroke. If we study the bullfrog or the palmate newt or the African clawed frog, whatever, what do you think we should be looking for? What, why would we want to focus on them? There's a really good reason, I think, to focus on them. What would that be? Why do that? Yeah, Tiffany.
I guess the first thing I thought of is how they can live alongside chytrid. So how come they can have it but not have symptoms and still live a normal life? It's not causing any reproductive issues or anything like that. So that's what I would first want to study.
Yeah, yeah. The I think very obvious question is what specific mechanism of the physiology, or it could be anatomy. I have a gnat just in my office. I know that came from Dr. Loafman's office. Um, what specific mechanism of the anatomy or physiology of the animal allows it to live in a essentially healthy state, even though it carries it? Um, because if we can understand that, we might be able to take that information and apply it in some manner to help other frogs. So, for example, if it is in some way a result of a specific gene or a specific set of genes, that could be very valuable information. Annabeth.
It has to be genetic. There's no way with frogs, at least I know that there are some hardy frogs out there, like we said, but frogs are just so sensitive with their
Yep.
physiology that it has to be some sort of genetic aspect. That's just where my mind goes automatically. But I don't know, maybe we just haven't found it yet, but I'm sure there's people out there looking.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. I think if I spent more than 15 minutes looking at these papers, I'd probably find some evidence for something. I'm wondering, and I don't know why I think this, but there's something in the back of my mind that's thinking, because chytrid affects the skin, that it could have to do with the thickness of the skin of the frog, maybe? I don't, this is conjecture, entirely conjecture. Right? Like, do bullfrogs have a slightly thicker skin than a lot of your other frogs? And I don't know why. That just seems like something I might look at. It could only be a couple cells more thick, but maybe that's all it takes. I don't know. Tiffany.
I think it would also be interesting to see how aquatic they are has an effect because
Mm,
obviously Xenopus are fully aquatic. Bullfrogs are fairly aquatic. Atelopus don't spend a lot of time in the water. They're actually a toad.
mhm.
So I think that would also I would wonder if maybe how much time they spend in and around water actually affects their susceptibility to it as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. There could be all sorts of questions I think you could ask, when you look at these individuals that are not susceptible and compare them to all these many, many, many susceptible individuals, um, where you might be able to start to tease apart what makes a frog able to deal with chytrid. And that is probably very valuable in making further decisions about how to help the frogs that can't deal with chytrid. So that's the sort of thing that I would be looking for, I think. Yeah, Bjorn.
So that's exactly what I was asking. And it's funny because I remember learning about that back when I was in undergrad in like 2015 or something like that. So quite a long time ago, but that was one thing that my professor talked about. Like that was something that was known. So it's interesting that like even the people who work in the industry, like we don't really know of those studies that have actually happened in the course of, a decade at least since I've first heard about this and the resistance of the cloud frog and the bullfrog. So it just seems like something would have spread it out since then, at least for the people who are in the industry.
Yeah, and maybe that work is out there. I don't work with frogs, I work with birds, so my knowledge of my updated information on chytrid fungus uh, research is well, I just read an abstract for the first time in probably 10 years while we were having this. I don't spend a lot of time researching this, so there might be. I think you just got to, if you want to know, you have to dig in and find out. Yeah, Taylor.
Do you think if like we did research on that and found out why these species are more resistant, that it would be a good idea to like how would you use that to help the frogs that are more susceptible? Like would you do like gene modification so like they're like expressing the characteristic that makes them more? Is that changing the species? Like how does that kind of work? Like how can you use that information like knowing oh like this frog has this, but this frog doesn't, but like that doesn't change that that frog doesn't. You know what I mean? Like how is that information going to benefit the frog that like is like struggling? Like unless you like maybe modify them somehow.
Yeah, that's a good question, Taylor. So it depends entirely on what the answer to the question is to begin with, right? If does that make sense? So if it is like I was saying, maybe bullfrogs have thicker skin. Yeah, I can't go in and change my uh, Atelopus skin without doing some serious molecular tinkering. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that. Uh, though we do the same sort of thing with plants all the time, and no one seems to care. So I guess I don't know why it's such a big deal to do that with a frog if it's going to save the species. Um, but yeah, so like if we found a gene that maybe it's not skin thickness, but maybe just some gene that's some resistant type of uh, attribute is provided to the bullfrog, and we're going to insert this gene into Atelopus now, that would be no different than when we take a gene and insert it into a tomato plant to give it cold tolerance. It's exactly the same thing. So if you're okay with your cold tolerant tomatoes, then you should be okay with your chytrid resistant frog that you make, right? Does that make sense? Because it's the same thing. So otherwise you're just kind of saying like it's okay to genetically modify these organisms, but not these organisms. And I don't really understand what the basis for that argument would be. That's just my opinion. Now, if you're just anti all GMO, then that's different. Really depends on what your philosophy is on that. But so it could have something to do with, well, like Tiffany was talking about the natural history of the animals and certain aspects of the natural history we can't do anything about. But let's just imagine for a second, we find out that in studying these bullfrogs, we find out that there's a certain, this is very, very fictional, okay? This is completely made up and not true at all. It's just a thought exercise. We find out that there's a specific way that they are exposed due to their natural history, and that in that form of exposure, the chytrid is not as dangerous. Okay, let's imagine that. I don't know what that form of exposure is. It doesn't matter. It's an exposure at a certain time of year, or an exposure that occurs in a certain location within a micro habitat or something like that. If we know that, we can maybe use that information and apply it to our frogs in such a way that when they get exposed in the same manner that is less dangerous. Now, that's a very, very fictional example, but it's an example nonetheless. In the case of chytrid fungus, I'm sure it doesn't apply. But I can't answer that question in its entirety without knowing what the answer is to begin with, and that's the point. It is oftentimes that when we find that sort of information, that we get a much greater perspective of how the pathogen, the fungus or whatever it is, affects the animal that we're trying to protect. And why, when we know why it doesn't affect one animal, that gives us inference into why it is so significant in affecting other animals. So it's valuable information. White nose syndrome in bats, there's similar studies and information that comes out of that. And so one thing they studied, this is going to sound silly if you don't know bats, but there's little brown bats and there's big brown bats. These are two different species of bat. And they found, if I'm recalling my bat literature correctly here, little brown bats really, really do not do good with the white nose. But big brown bats are fairly robust when they get exposed to white nose. One of the big differences had to do with fat reserves. Just simply the amount of mass before they go into caves to overwinter. The amount of fat reserves that the two species have is very, very different. And so that tells us something about the very strong importance of the availability of food resources prior to overwintering for those species. If they have enough fat reserves, they might be able to survive it, right? The reason for that is because white nose syndrome essentially disrupts the normal migration, not migration, what's the word I'm looking for? Sleeping in the winter time. Hibernation, that's the word I'm looking for. The normal hibernation of the bats. And it like wakes them up and they burn a lot of extra energy. And so like they don't have enough fat reserves, it kills them. But they saw, hey, in these bats, they don't have a problem or a much less of a problem. And that's because they have so many more fat reserves. If you have food availability for the little brown bats that is high enough, and we're talking, of course, insect biomass, maybe they'll, maybe they can make it. And so now the question moves sort of downstream or moves away from the bat itself, and it moves to the insect populations, right? And like, can we support an insect population that can support fat reserves in these bats? So that's sort of an example of how you look at the surviving individual to make inference about what you need to do for the one that's having a problem. Okay. I didn't know we were going to talk about bats tonight. I would have refreshed myself. It's been a while. Okay. Boy, we went all kind of places with that one. That was exciting. Oh, I guess I wanted to actually answer this question myself. So this was all question 19. Has the ARC program been successful or a failure? And what I wrote in my notes is that I would probably say that it is a failure, but a failure with silver linings. A failure that did manage to accomplish some positive things, but did certainly fell far short of what its intent was, right? So I think we can recognize the positives that come out of things while still accepting that they were overall, they did not succeed. It's like getting a D on a test. I learned a few things, but I'm not calling that a success by any stretch. But I must have learned something. I didn't get an F. So, uh, yeah, that's kind of how I viewed it. It's fallen far short of its goal while still managing to pull some positives out, and so we can celebrate the positives while still being realistic about the negatives. This, I think, question's probably pretty straightforward, but would love someone to play devil's advocate on this question just for fun. If not, I'll do it. Should zoos prioritize a greater proportion of amphibians in their XC2 conservation efforts? Given limitations on budget and space, how might they set on making these animals a greater priority? What do you think? Annabeth.
Okay. Obviously, I think that they should, but I feel as though this is this is the discussion question,
It
right?
is a discussion question, yeah.
Okay. Okay, good. I feel like they should because amphibians are great and they are of very dire conservation concern. However, I don't think that zoos should if they don't have the resources to do so. Um, I mean, if they don't have the budget or the space, they can't, and you cannot force them to do that. Even though I accept that it's dire that you need to do that. It's hard to do. It's hard to like keep those amphibians if you don't have the resources to begin with. And so you can't really force them to house a greater proportion of amphibians if they can't in the first place.
Okay. Does anyone have any other thoughts? Caitlin.
I just wanted to add that like not only is their conservation need really great, but I also think that there's like a pretty large lack of understanding of amphibians by the general public. I cannot tell you how many people when I was an amphibian keeper would respond with like, "Oh, I don't like snakes." And I was like, "Well, you're in luck because I don't work with snakes because I'm an amphibian keeper." But like a lot of people don't even know what an amphibian is to then even know that they're in this major conservation crisis. So like I would argue that they're worth exhibiting just because there's such a knowledge gap with the public about amphibians. And when they are exhibited in zoos, they're often like there's a couple tanks in the reptile house and they feel very much like an afterthought. It doesn't always feel like it was this well thought of plan with like good messaging and like good exhibitry. It just feels like, oh, we had a small space, so we threw a frog in it. So I definitely feel there should be more of an emphasis on amphibians and that like more zoos should be having like robust programming around amphibians.
Yeah, it's a great point. Ryan?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on the fact that it is just so much cheaper and easier to be able to physically house and maintain these animals. And I say that in like zoos. My zoo just made a post about how much it costs to feed our 800 elephants that we have, and now it's so expensive, and pointed out like, well, when you buy a ticket, you're helping out with this or whatever. If you have the resources or at least the strategies to be able to feed elephants or lions or tigers, and this goes for all zoos, I think you can somehow manage to have these smaller animals. And not only because it's easier, but also because there's more of a need for it. And that sounds really critical, but I just think it's not a resource issue. It's not a like they don't have the ability to participate in one way or another. It's a prioritization issue. It's they would rather care for these other animals that are going to get crowds moving, which is important, but they would rather spend all this money on mammals in general, or reptiles over amphibians. And I think that's where um I don't know. It doesn't justify not having them, in my opinion. But it's a definitely a prioritization issue, in my opinion.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. Tiffany?
Uh, I'm gonna kind of maybe I'll be the one naysayer. I don't think zoos are the proper facilities to be caring for these endangered species. I think specialty facilities just for the conservation of frogs might be better for this. Part of that is because I fully understand how difficult it is to learn the husbandry of a species that no one else has taken care of before, or maybe one facility has done it, but you can't replicate the setup that they did that works for them. So now you're kind of just figuring things out based off of a very small plan. And zoos currently, like if we're talking about zoos that already have large collections, need to retrofit spaces to fit these brand new species that no one has ever cared for. I don't think a zoo is the right facility to learn that expertise, considering we've already learned that there is no really good proxy species for many of these amphibians we need to bring into captivity. I think something like Amphibian Arc, for example, where that is their dedication, where they are dedicated to learning how to care for, introduce, save these specific species, would be more suited to something like this than trying to either teach a keeper how to do it now or having to bring in entirely new um, people to just learn how to care for this one or two species when you're so worried about putting resources somewhere else. I definitely really feel like in situ is probably more important at this point, because habitat is such a big part of saving these species, that I feel like dedicating all of your resources to it instead of a portion of your resources might be a little bit more beneficial.
Okay. Uh, Caitlin.
Even though I said like yes, they should listed reasons to lend to Tiffany's point, like it is really specialized care to care for like a lot of amphibians. And at Detroit, like we have an RO, a reverse osmosis vat, and then we have a vat of like RO water that's been reconstituted with other things we want to add in. We have multiple biosecure rooms for breeding dusky gopher frogs, Wyoming toads, Puerto Rican crested toads. Atelopus, and striped newts, because like those are animals that part of like a very specific breeding program. We have like a whole cricket room for breeding crickets of different sizes to feed out to all of our amphibians of different sizes. So like even though I do think more zoos should put the effort in, it is a big specialized effort to really pull it off, I think. So like it is a tax of resources.
Ryan.
Do you think so I don't know, I don't think this is common for all zoos, but like my zoo happens to be a bigger zoo and we have a amphibian conservation center in our zoo. It's actually weirdly sandwiched in our great apes department. And that center, like the building's really cool because it actually was a hallway supposed to be for a panda exhibit that never happened. And it had to be converted into a place where amphibians can live, and they do conservation work in there. My question is, do you think if more zoos participated in things like that, having the resources, do you still think that would make much of an impact on the overall conservation, in being an XC2 conservation method, as opposed to the in situ? Obviously, in situ we've talked about is recommended or preferred in most cases. But even if more zoos start doing stuff like this, do you think that will really have much of an impact in comparison to the in situ stuff?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I assume that question is just addressed to the whole room here. But what I would say is, and I'm going to answer it just because I want to very quickly move on to one final question, because class is about over. Um, it depends entirely on the nature of the problem underlying the species, right? As we've discussed with some other animals in the class, there have been times where XC2 was ultimately the savior of a species, right? And there have been times where XC2 is, and there are many times when XC2 is not necessary at all. And so a lot of it has to do with the nature of the problem. Uh, so I do want to move real quickly to, there's just one question in Wilder Kingdom, chapter 12. There's plenty of things to talk about in this. So just maybe briefly, if a few people want to share their points. Cleo, you better share your point. I don't have a marker for you in the last hour, dude. So you get to share your point. So what's the relevance of zoo architecture to human experience in zoos, welfare of captive zoo animals, and conservation efforts? Any or all of those things?
Okay, I'll go, but you're a liar because I did speak this hour. Uh, Zoo architecture relates directly to human experiences in the zoo. People that frequent zoos are often able to view animals from multiple angles, such as watching animals from above or walking through tunnels in an aquarium. Zoos base attendance based off of what architecture is needed to increase funding and to allow for better viewing experiences. Sorry, this is really long. The welfare of captive zoo animals also is tied into zoo architecture, as buildings and enclosures are constantly being updated to ensure the best possible welfare is being reached and making the enclosures as naturalistic as possible. This allows for natural behaviors to be exhibited as well as people feeling more of a connection to the enclosures and the animals. This also ties in with conservation efforts, as architecture enables people to see a connection to the habitats that the animals live within and how to help out through being more conservation minded. And educational programs revolve around being able to tie in architecture and the environment to establish those connections.
Very good. You answered all three. Good. Guess I could check you off now. Uh, does anybody else have any thoughts about these things? It's an interesting chapter. It's a little like a different angle on, you don't think about architecture much when you're thinking about conservation. So at least I don't. Ryan.
I was really excited to read this chapter and was honestly a little bit not let down, but let down because I don't know, I get everything like Cleo just mentioned, but I would have really liked to get down to some of the nitty-gritty into like how certain designs actually impact a lot of the things like human experience. They just kind of said it does and that improved enclosures and stuff. And I think we all kind of know that a more naturalistic exhibit is going to have more of an emotional connection to people, pro-environmental behaviors. Um, and it did say in the chapter that there's not a lot of research on this at all, which I am kind of bummed out about because I think it's cool to see like how zoos physically, how the buildings physically have changed and evolved to benefit these things. Like going from glass enclosures and concrete floors to exhibits that are more open and the interactive exhibits to even like how are you going to build something that promotes conservation but also biodiversity, like mixed species exhibits, stuff like that, which is something I would like to do some like personal study on. It's really interesting.
It is really interesting. And it's yeah, I think it is an understudied thing. That's like I said, when I think about conservation, I think architecture's probably really far in the back of my mind. It's just not something that intuitively, at least to me, pops up, but it does. It's very relevant in some aspects. Yeah, Tiffany.
I can't remember what exactly made me think of this, but there was two things I kept thinking of while I was reading it, and one was Philadelphia Zoo is literally a historic site. So they are limited on how they are actually able to retrofit. They have to maintain a lot of the time the facade of a building while still making the interior feasible for a brand new sometimes an entirely different animal collection. I know recently they're retrofitting their reptile house, but there there are regulations about what they're actually able to do. So I think that's something also really interesting to think about. I don't know what it is exactly with Bronx, but Bronx, their Komodo dragons are in their old elephant building. They had to retrofit that building to hold an entirely different animal. So I think that's also something I would have liked them to kind of touch a little bit more on is they talked a lot about brand new parts of the zoo. But it's like, but what about some of these very old zoos who don't have space to add more buildings and are now retrofitting old buildings that they're not even allowed to tear down and start over. They have to use what they have and do the best they can. So I just kept thinking about that in the back of my head is like Philly and Bronx, these old facilities that Philly literally cannot expand. There is no room around it. It has the space it has, unless they're tearing down housing and stuff like that. Um, so I wish I would have talked a little bit more about also using what you already have and how that affects the architecture we use.
Yeah, it's interesting you're talking about like the historic facades of the buildings and how they have to keep those. Um, that has it would be interesting. You could use a space like that and compare it to more modern spaces, and you could do some kind of study with that. So there you go, Ryan. Now you've got a project. You have to go to Philly Zoo. But like yeah, you could do like some sort of survey-based project looking at modern zoos and I don't know what all other zoos would qualify to be similar to the Philly Zoo in that respect, but if you could get a couple of them, you might be able to do some sort of comparison. What I think you would find is uh, a demographic difference in response to those spaces. And that's because of nostalgia. I think you would find that older folks that had connections to those spaces as that are, with the older styles and things due to nostalgia might appreciate them much more than younger folks who are looking for a modern sort of experience. I don't know for sure, but nostalgia is very powerful. I can tell you that. Ryan.
Adding on to that, we talk a lot about zoos being kind of a community center, and I know for ours, like I grew up going there, and that was just kind of families in the area, like you spend your summers at the zoo, and that was just kind of the big thing. So when they took down old buildings. We had Red Barn, which was like a petting zoo area that went away, and a lot of people had something to say. Or our sea lion exhibit. Our pool was like before the zoo was a zoo, it was a park, and there was a public pool that got buried because of the polio epidemic, and it got eventually turned into our sea lion pool. And my dad actually proposed to my mom there many, many, many years ago. And it's gone now because they have a nicer sea lion enclosure. But a lot of people were like, what the heck, our polio pool.
Yeah, yeah. We just had at Ogilvy Zoo, there's a big kerfuffle. Some people here in the chat may be familiar with Ogilvy's the little tiny zoo down the road, but um, for years and years, as long as I can remember, they had a room. It was called the train room, and in this room, they had this absolutely massive train set, that went around the room, and they had like a table with all this little models all around it and everything. It was cute. I liked it when I was a little kid, and I went there. It was there, and it was awesome. It was really cool. They very, very recently, like the last, well, 6 months or something, decided to take that out after like, I don't know, many decades of it being there. People were furious, absolutely furious. They want to convert that room and they put some animals in it. I don't, someone in here might. Cleo, do you know what animals? Does anybody know what animals when? I don't know. They decided to turn it into an animal room. Yeah, people wanted the train. That's what they wanted. They wanted their train. So yeah, there was a big upset in the Wheeling area about Ogilvy doing that. I wonder where the train went to. That train, it's like an antique train. Do you know how much money that train was worth? Holy moly. Um, Someone probably sold it for a hot dollar and pocketed it, honestly.
I don't know. Zoos are hoarders. It's probably in a back room somewhere.
That's a good point. But anyways, I think there's a lot that more to talk about with the architecture thing. But we are out of time for tonight, so we'll go ahead and wrap up there. Yeah, Cleo?
Okay, I don't know if this is accurate, but it might be the red panda.
In that room?
I don't know. I just searched up what animal took over the train room at Ogilvy, and it said red panda. I don't know if that's true. No.
I was also gonna say, I think it was red panda or the golden line tamarins, I think are in that
I
hall too.
I think I think it's them. I'm not 100% either way. Either way, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, what really matters is how mad people were that they got rid of the train. Um, that was a beloved train. Okay, so all right, let's wrap up tonight. Great discussion, everyone. Only a couple more weeks and we'll be wrapped up. So have a good night.